Welcome back. Today I want to do something a little bit different. I found this cool Yamaha K340 cassette deck from the mid-80s, and I feel like it'll serve to explain something that I've never really talked about: tape bias. Now, I realize a lot of you already know what tape bias is, but I'm sure there are just as many out there who have heard the term but have no idea what it is or what it does. So today, I'd like to try to explain tape bias for those who are just starting out in this hobby in a way that isn't too complicated and hopefully not technical at all. Plus, I want to show you this really cool Yamaha deck. So let's dive in, yeah? All right, so what is tape bias? What does that actually mean? Well, before I explain tape bias, I kind of need to go back to junior high science classes for a second and talk about magnetism. If you look at the tape itself, it consists of a polymer film coated in a really fine powder of some material that can be magnetized. Most of the time, that's literally just iron oxide or rust. Sometimes you do also find other formulations with elements like chromium, cobalt, or nickel, but it's basically anything that can turn into a permanent magnet. So now, this is probably obvious, but a speaker is an electromagnet, and when you play music through it, what you're doing is recreating the pattern of vibrations in the air with a similar pattern of electrical pulses in the magnet, which pushes and pulls on the paper cone. So the waveform of the sound is the motion of the speaker, the motion of the current in the wire, and the motion of your eardrum. So if you can turn the sound into a magnetic field and move a speaker cone, you can also put that same audio signal into a tiny electromagnet and run a tape past it to create a record of what you just heard. That's essentially what a tape recorder does. Now, here's where things get a little bit messy. Magnetizable materials have a property called hysteresis. That's a fancy way of saying that the material stays magnetized in the direction of the magnetic field that was most recently applied to it. So you could look at the material and tell which way the magnet was facing when it interacted with that material. Now, obviously that's a really simplified version of the idea, but hopefully that makes sense. The problem is the strength of the field that was applied to the material and the strength of the field that's retained are not always consistent. In fact, they're consistently inconsistent. As the frequency of your signal increases, the material tends to magnetize more easily and more accurately. That also goes for the amplitude or volume of the signal. So the louder it is, the stronger it is. The problem is, if a sound is a little bit quieter on the original signal, it's a lot quieter on the recording. And same is true for the frequency. If the lower and higher frequency are the same in the original signal, the lower frequency will be quieter on the recording than the high frequency. Peter Steele will always be quieter than Rob Halford. It's not a technical flaw, it's a fundamental fact of magnetism, and you can't really get around it. Except you can if you employ a bias signal. Now, what some clever people figured out in the 1920s and then again in the 30s was if you mix a consistent high-frequency signal into the existing audio signal, one that's much higher than our ears can pick up, you can actually get the lower frequencies and quieter sections to imprint much louder and much more evenly into the recording so that they match the audio signal almost exactly. That's the bias signal. It's a high-frequency signal that allows the actual audio information to go onto the tape correctly. Now, each machine is a little bit different, but most of the time the bias signal is either filtered out by the deck when it plays or is simply beyond what the speakers, the tape, or our ears are capable of reproducing. Either way, we don't hear it and it's not an issue. Except when it is. And that brings me to this Yamaha cassette deck because it's got a feature that deals with the occasional problem that a bias signal can create. So let's take a break from the technical stuff for some show and tell and look at this cool deck. This is the Yamaha K340. It's a two-head cassette deck from the mid-80s that came in matte black like I have here and a silver version that I don't have here. Here's a picture of it. It's a mid-tier deck, but if you ask me, I think it's got a really nice sound and it's very capable. So let's take a look. The power button is on the left side. When it comes on, the only light you see is the tape type indicator. You have your cassette carriage with a nice thick acrylic window and the quintessentially 80s embossed square pattern on either side. To open it, you hit the eject button. The door is dampened just enough to not slam, but still opens quickly. On the inside, you can see the read and record head and the erase head. We'll look at what this means in a minute. The transport controls are all soft touch buttons, and the mechanics are activated by a computer-controlled mechanism, because computers are the future. When you press a button, the heads and the pinch roller move into place and begin playing the tape. You have your 5 basic transport controls: rewind, play, fast forward, record and pause, which are the same button, and stop. This 6th button is mute and search. The mute search button is an interesting feature. It serves 2 purposes, one of which is dependent upon the other. When you're recording something, if you hit it, it'll record a 4-second blank spot, then pause the tape. You would use that when you're making mixtapes at the end of every song as you add them. And the reason that you do that is when you play it back, if you hold the button and hit either fast forward or rewind, the machine will automatically skip to the next blank and begin playing. This thing can actually skip songs automatically, which is a pretty cool feature to have on a cassette deck. Above the transport controls are a pair of buttons labeled Intro Scan. Those do a similar thing to the mute search button, except instead of continuing to play, it only plays about 15 seconds of whatever section it lands on, then it'll jump to the next section, stopping each time on the blank interval that you added with that mute search button. It sort of lets you preview the tape that you made so that you can find a specific song or just see what's on that unlabeled tape in the bottom of the drawer, assuming that it was made on this machine. Above the intro scan buttons is the tape counter. That acts mostly as a reference point for the tape so that it's easier to go back to a given position. To mark that spot, just hit the reset and the indicator will go to 0 and you can easily get back to that same place later. Assuming that you're using the same tape and you haven't played it in anything else or played another tape on this machine since. On the right side are your 2 record level knobs, one for the right and one for the left channel. I like that they use 2 separate knobs instead of the coaxial ones you sometimes get. Next to them are the Dolby Noise Reduction selector switch and the Auto Mode selector, both of which are round just like the record level knobs. The Dolby selector gives you the option of B-type and C-type. It's always best to use them when you record, so anything you record on this machine should use the most recent Dolby type, which is C. That'll give you the best results for recording and playback. But not all recordings use Dolby Noise Reduction. In fact, most pre-recorded albums don't. At least modern ones don't. So if that's the case, you have the option to disengage it. If you don't, it sounds muddy. Type B is also an option if you have another cassette player you plan on using which only has that setting. For reference, any machine that just says noise reduction or Dolby noise reduction or something like that, that's going to be Dolby B. They just didn't specify it because at the time there wasn't another option. The auto mode switch has 4 settings. Well, okay, 3 technically since one of them is just off. That doesn't really count, I guess. The timer function is like most other machines I've shown that have it. It lets you connect the machine to a timer and will either play or record automatically as soon as power is supplied to the deck. We've seen that before in previous videos. The instructions suggest using it as an alarm clock. The repeat function is pretty straightforward, but it has a tiny little twist. It'll play through the whole side of the tape, rewind to the beginning, and then play it back. And it will just repeat that process. But not indefinitely. It will do it exactly 8 times. No more, no less.
No more, no less.
I'm not entirely sure why they went with 8 times. If anybody has any thoughts on why they went with that number, please let me know in the comments. I appreciate the look of the display that they use, though. It's got a nice thick piece of acrylic in the front, and all the indicators are pretty easy to read. It even automatically detects the tape type, so you don't have to set that yourself. You can see the little tabs inside the tape mailbox that let it detect what type of tape you have and set the bias level automatically. The right and left decibel meters, they are the simple LED style, but I think they look nice. To the left of the display is a label that reads HX Pro Dynamic Bias Servo. That's something you see on a lot of higher end cassette decks from this time period, but what does that mean? The HX stands for headroom extension. Yeah, I know extension doesn't start with X, but it was the 80s, and HE Pro truthfully isn't nearly as cool sounding. Besides, he only belongs at the front of one thing in the 80s. The term headroom in this case refers to how much the audio signal can exceed its intended level without clipping. That's a fancy way of saying how loud it can get without sounding all weird and distorted. The idea behind HX Pro is that when you record a high frequency signal and a bias signal, sometimes that can push the volume of the recording past the clipping point of the tape itself, and the playback will sound weird. So they adjust the intensity of the bias signal in real time to make sure that it doesn't oversaturate the recording. Because remember, higher frequencies record louder. It's actually a really clever workaround, I think. Now, the HX Pro isn't the only thing that they've labeled on the front of this machine. They're calling this deck a, quote, natural sound stereo cassette deck, and they also point out a Sendust head. So let's take a look at what those two things refer to. The Sendust head is one that's made from a combination of iron, silicon, and aluminum in a fine powder and pressed into a shape, in this case, the read and record head. The most common alternative to the Sendust head is Permalloy, which is an 80-20 mix of iron and nickel. It's actually the same ratio I like for hamburger meat. Each of the two head types has slightly different properties for playback and recording, but according to what I read online, the Sendust ones are meant to be a little less prone to wear, though they're also slightly less responsive during playback as a trade-off. There's also the natural sound thing. What is that about? Well, in this case, it's more of a marketing term than anything else. Yamaha believed that their stereo systems, radios, cassette players, and whatever else sounded as close to live as possible, and they gave that assumed quality the name natural sound. It's not any kind of special technology or specific hardware. As I look across the front, I can't help but think that it evokes Nakamichi with its little round knobs and angled buttons that look like roofing shingles. That's certainly not a bad thing. I'd say it's a very handsome and nice looking piece of equipment for being just a modest matte black with very few lights or gimmicks on the front. It doesn't look cheap and it doesn't feel cheap. And when we open it up, you'll see that the whole case is a single sturdy piece of sheet metal. Now, before we open it up, let's take a quick look at the back. A few interesting things going on actually. Obviously, you have the line in and line out RCA jacks and the power cord, but what I found particularly interesting were a couple of passages in the text. HX Pro was, in fact, developed by Danish company Bang & Olufsen and licensed for use under the Dolby trademark. It wasn't actually Dolby Labs that created it. The other thing worth noting is on the bottom of this silver sticker. Under license of Star, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, SA, Brussels, Belgium. That's referring to a patent for a tape transport mechanism that ensures proper alignment of the cartridge within the mechanism itself. I'm also forced to wonder what SD stands for and why whoever had it before me bothered to engrave it on the back. All right, let's open this thing up. There are 5 screws this time, 2 larger screws on either side and a 5th smaller one on the back. To get the shell off, you have to slide it back a little bit and lift it up. You can see the entire circuit board is laid out in sections and clearly labeled. The cassette transport mechanism is easy to see, as well as the display board, the transformer, and that nice steel case. There are 2 1-amp, 250-volt cartridge fuses as well. It's always good to know where those are if the thing suddenly stops working. All right, so let's put the lid back on this pickle jar and I'll demo the sound for you, because if you're still watching, you probably want to know how it sounds. So here we go. Okay, so what I'm doing is recording directly to the cassette and then syncing it together in post. This is just an example of speech, since I'm guessing you guys are probably as tired as I am of hearing the songs that I always use to do the demos for these things. So I hope this is coming through all right. Okay, so that, my friends, is the lovely Yamaha K340 and a painfully oversimplified explanation of tape bias. I hope everybody found that interesting and informative. If you're wondering how to play or record a tape with this, it works exactly the same as most machines with soft touch controls, and I'll put a link in the corner to another video that shows how to do that on a similar machine. For the next video, I have something cool from Bang & Olufsen, so stick around for that. So see you guys soon, keep thrifting, and stay metal.